Would you like anything? I'm fine. Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to kickstart this event. Welcome to everyone who is here in the audience. Welcome to our online participants as well to this event, Renegotiating the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, Next Steps and Key Issues. By attendance, one would think this is topical. I really want to welcome, firstly, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce delegation to Brookings and to the Chamber's President, Candice Lang. I also want to welcome our distinguished guest, Jean Charest, who's former Premier of Quebec and Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. I'm going to introduce them both shortly, as well as the other distinguished panelists. So we're here today to discuss the state of the North American trade relationship, I'm going to call it USMCA, and the USMCA review, which is going to be taking place over the next 9 to 12 months. I just want to give you a few data points to set the scene. Canada, the United States' largest goods market in 2024, worth $334 billion, and Mexico was the United States' second largest export market. And if you add in services, US exports to Canada were worth $440 billion last year. Just to give you a point of contrast, US exports to China last year of goods and services was around $200 billion. So the Canadian market alone is almost 2.5 times the Chinese market for US exports. And trade amongst the United States, Canada and Mexico supports around 17 million jobs. So the good news is that the United States' first and second largest export markets, Canada and Mexico, are also our neighbours. They are democracies and they are peaceful. So trade with Canada and Mexico is also, in many respects, complementary to the US economy. So that collectively, the United States is stronger with Canada and Mexico, particularly when it comes to addressing geopolitical challenges from China. For instance, Canada and Mexico have large amounts of critical minerals and rare earths and can help the United States break China's chokehold over these products. Mexico's an alternative, lower-cost destination for manufacturing, thereby helping reshore supply chains from China back to North America. But there's more, whether it is in the realm of the production of energy, pharmaceuticals, aircraft, electrical products, or cars. The United States, Mexico, and Canada have developed integrated manufacturing operations that maximize efficiency and competitiveness. Now, I know that talking about efficiency in Washington these days can seem like a little bit of a dirty word when security seems to trump everything. But I sort of suggest that it is because Canada and Mexico are friends and allies that it is one place where the US can afford to focus on maximizing efficiencies in ways that it no longer can with economic relations with China and others. Or to put it another way, we should be aiming to strengthen economic relations with countries where we can still aim to maximize efficiency, which will offset some of the other costs that will come from having to index security in our economic relations. Now, the United States, Mexico, and Canada, as everyone in this room I think knows, has a trade agreement. The United States, Mexico-Canada agreement, negotiated and signed by President Trump during his first term in office. Now, this agreement includes a commitment to a review that is to take place by the middle of next year, 6 years after the agreement has come into force. And effectively, The review requires all the parties, the three governments, to agree to extend the USMCA for another 16-year term. The agreement actually expires 16 years after coming into effect. This is in 2036. Failure to agree to extend that term by 2036 will lead to the agreement expiring. Now, since coming into office, President Trump has placed tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada. This initially comprised IEPA, International Economic Emergency Power Act tariffs, to address flows of illegal immigrants and fentanyl, but has been followed as well by Section 232 national security tariffs across a range of sectors, including auto, steel, aluminum, copper, lumber, and more recently, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and a range of other Section 232 are in the work and proposed. So these 232 tariffs are impacting in quite significant ways trade across the United States, Canada, and Mexico in these key sectors, and will continue to do so. So this upcoming USMCA review is going to be a critical opportunity to discuss both how to modernise the agreement to deal with challenges that have come up since the USMCA came into effect, but it's also going to be the place where the US, Canada and Mexico are going to try to address the current high tariffs that are in place between the three countries. So let me stop there. I want to give you a brief few administrative marks and run of events. I'm going to shortly introduce Candice Lang, who's going to come to the podium and make some short introductory remarks. We're then going to transition into our panel. We're going to have a moderated conversation between myself and the three panelists, and then we will open it up to audience Q&A. So please ready your questions. So let me now have the pleasure of introducing Candice Lang, who is the President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. She's an executive leader with more than 20 years of experience across a whole range of sectors in Canada, including mining, manufacturing, agriculture, education, and healthcare, and spent over a decade with Nutrien, where she led their sustainability and human resources efforts and served on the executive leadership team. She's had a range of other experiences, but her bio is available. So with that, let me invite Candice up to the podium.
Well, hello, everyone. Hello to those of you in the room and all of those joining online. And I'm really pleased to be able to provide some opening remarks and maybe some stage setting before we dive deep with the panel. And I would encourage, as Joshua said, be ready with your questions, because it'll be a good opportunity to, I think, take a deep dive into what questions you have and what is, in fact, the path forward for our Continental Trade Agreement, USMCA, CUSMA, as we like to say. But first, a quick thank you to Joshua and team and the Brookings Institution for hosting this critical conversation. It's so appreciated. And presumably it's a critical conversation at a very critical time. But I would say, in the context of just even the past week, no matter what happens week to week or day to day, we, the Canadian business community, remain focused on the long-term potential we have, the foundation of which is USMCA or CUSMA. So next July, this trade agreement that supports millions of North American jobs, billions in trade, and underpins, importantly, a third of global GDP is up for review. It's not an exaggeration to say that what happens in the 2026 USMCA review will shape the economic future of our continent and have a huge impact globally as well. Just a little bit about the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, if you're less familiar. It is Canada's largest and most activated business network, and we serve a membership of over 400 chambers of commerce and boards of trade, and more than 200,000 businesses of all sizes and sectors and regions. And in the past few years, we've become increasingly a valuable partner to the Canadian companies wanting to engage in global trade and investment. But I'm here today not just as an advocate of Canadian businesses, but also because Canada, the US, and Mexico have this common interest and passion for advancing a vision of a North America that is rooted in collective economic security and prosperity. I'm so pleased to be joined in the room, as Joshua mentioned, by a delegation of Canadian business leaders and government officials, distinguished guests. This is our fourth business-led trade mission to the United States in 2025. And we know while governments negotiate the deals, we cannot forget that it is businesses that actually engage in trade. Before this year, I think we have all reflected on it has been easy to take the USMCA for granted. But I think now we all agree nobody's taking it for granted, especially in light of the president's recent decision to suspend trade discussions with Canada. For Canadian businesses, the success of USMCA is of existential importance. The Canadian the Canadian Chamber has a business data lab that is fairly new. And earlier this year, we reported a 20-year high in USMCA utilization. In July, we had 85% of Canadians' goods exported to the U.S. claiming the USMCA tariff preferences to ensure that tariff-free access to the U.S. market. There's so much at stake in the 2026 review, and not just economically, as I shared. North America's prosperity is the foundation of its security. Stable rules-based trade with your closest allies beats dependence on distant, less reliable, or dominated supply chains with choke points, as you already said, Joshua, every time. Together, we are a production powerhouse. And if you disrupt our integration, our markets will shrink. We should not, at a moment when our global rivals are investing heavily to take market share, we shouldn't compete amongst ourselves. The smart fight is North America competing with the world, not with itself. That means resisting unilateral trade and policy decisions that disrupt our economic integration and destroy the value we've spent decades building. It means making our cross-border corridors even more efficient, so goods and services move without costly bottlenecks. And it means aligning in key areas like critical minerals, energy infrastructure, and advanced manufacturing so that our economies, not our competitors, can set the terms of the next industrial era. We have a lot at stake. We have a lot to lose, but the opportunity for gain is even greater. The 2026 review is a chance to modernize this agreement and to strengthen North American economic security and resilience and build a robust competitiveness agenda. And I would be remiss not to mention that it is a chance to grow our supply chain integration by reducing, or better still, eliminating the recently added tariffs and trade barriers. The question isn't whether we'll face challenges in the upcoming review. We will. The question is whether we'll approach those challenges with the right strategic ambition they deserve, or will we get bogged down in politics of division? As global trade and politics grow more fractured, we should be building on the already established and trusted relationships and moving forwards, not backwards. We're at this critical juncture in our relationship, and it deserves our best efforts because our belief is that the immense potential for the North American economic leadership has not yet been fully realized, and now the stakes are even higher than they've ever been. But also our potential, the role it can play, has never mattered more. I'm delighted to hear from our distinguished panelists on this important topic. And as I said, be ready with your good questions because we want to take advantage of the share of mind we will now bring to this stage. So I will transition and cede the stage to our distinguished panel guests. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jen. Yep. There we go. In the middle? You want some water, Peter?
Yeah, I'd love some. Thank you.
There we go.
Great. Excellent. Thank you, Candice. I think that provided a really appropriate setting for the conversation we're about to have this afternoon. So let me briefly introduce our panelists and then we will get into the conversation. Starting with our two in-person panelists, Jean Charest is one of Canada's most recognised political leaders, having served as Deputy Prime Minister of Canada and Premier of Quebec with a public service career spanning nearly 30 years. He entered Parliament in 1984 as one of Canada's youngest cabinet ministers, later serving as Minister of the Environment before becoming Deputy Prime Minister. He also, in government, initiated negotiations for the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement and is currently a partner, I'm going to get this wrong, a Terrien Couture and Joli Coeur.
That's correct. Terrien Couture Joli Coeur.
Thank you for that. That's Australia and France mixing inappropriately. Peter Harold, the next to my left, is a visiting scholar at Georgetown University's Institute of International Economic Law and non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. From 2021 to 2022, Peter served at the White House as Senior Director for International Economics, where he led efforts to secure US supply chains, advance digital and telecommunications policy, and coordinate sanctions and export controls on Russia. Previously, he's held senior roles as well at the US State Department and the National Security Council. Online, I want to welcome Jorge Esteve, who is the CEO of Agro Industries Unidas de Mexico, which is part of Ecom Agroindustrial, a global leader in agricultural commodities, and president of Grupo Copri, a Mexican real estate and infrastructure firm. Jorge is currently also serving as president of the National Agricultural Council. And earlier in his career, he held senior executive roles at HSBC Latin America and the Caribbean. Jorge, welcome and thank you for joining us. So we've got a lot to cover, but I thought one of the ways we might get into this conversation, given we have representatives from the three countries here, is to maybe level set a little around what so far has been the impact, you can talk about it economically or politically or otherwise, of US trade policy towards Canada and Mexico and the tariffs specifically.
I can. Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And Candice, it's a pleasure to join the Canadian delegation here in Washington and to be at the Brookings Institute, Joshua. For Canadians in the room, it won't be a surprise to learn that the impact on Canada politically and economically has been extremely important. And let me start with the political side. We had a federal election campaign after the Trump election. And the Trudeau government had been in power for a number of years. And if you sort of assume that 9 years is the past due date of any government in any circumstances except mine, the predictions and the polls were very clear that the Trudeau government would probably be defeated handsomely and by the Conservatives. All of that changed, Joshua, in the campaign. The issue became who is the best person to face Donald Trump. And Mark Carney emerges as the leader of the Liberal Party, past governor of the Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of England, very well known in the business community. He was with Brookfield at the time. And we had an election campaign that was essentially a referendum about who is the best person to lead. And Mark Carney won. He didn't quite win a majority government. We're in a British parliamentary system, but very close. And his mandate essentially is to deal with this issue with Mr. Trump. But the subtext of it is equally, if not more important. His mandate is also to change Canada's economy and to transform our economy and to draw lessons from how come we're in a situation today where we are so dependent on our American neighbor, which, by the way, we draw a distinction between whoever's leading politically and the American people. Canadians love the American people. They're neighbors, they're friends, allies. We do believe that we are very fortunate to live in this neighborhood. And the same is true as we entered into that relationship with Mexico. And so for us, though, there's sort of a moment of truth. And I'm among those who believe that we will thank Donald Trump, President Trump, in 20 years from now for having shaken Canadians out of their complacency and forced us to look at how we run our economy. And there's three, and I'll close by that. There's three areas in which you'll see major changes in Canada. One is how we run our economy and how we need to be more efficient. And this is about us, first, about us. Secondly, how we run our federal system of government. We're one of the most decentralized federations in the world, with the provinces responsible for natural resources. The only other federation more decentralized than Canada is Belgium, and no one knows how Belgium works. Anyone from Belgium in the room? Okay. So, and the third area is international policy, Joshua. What role do we as Canadians want to play in the world? So that's for us. This is going to be a very, very significant moment as we navigate these changes with CUSMA and our relationship with the United States, and hopefully build and reinforce this great relationship we also have with Mexico.
Great. Peter, can I ask you?
Yeah, no, first let me begin by thanking you and Brookings for having me here today. It's really an honor for me to join such a distinguished panel. I also want to pick up on a part of the personal side of the previous comments. I was just in Canada this past weekend. It was my third trip to Canada this year. It's very clear that the human bonds remain very strong, right? And I think if any of you've been, human bonds remain very strong. Now, my mother-in-law happens to live in a retirement community in South Carolina. She says Canadians aren't visiting anymore, but I sort of understand that, and I think we'll get past that situation. But in terms of the overall macroeconomic impacts, I think and political impacts, I would bifurcate here between how the political community is reacting to what Donald Trump has done and how the business community is reacting to what Donald Trump has done. I think if you are in the political community, whether you are sort of a U.S. Federal politician or you're in the sort of policy-making realm, your reaction to what Donald Trump has done has been highly polarized along partisan lines. Almost no one is actually substantively in favor of what Donald Trump has done politically, other than President Trump and a couple of his advisors. But what you've basically seen very practically, again, in the political realm, is that if you are a Republican, if you are in part of the Trump administration's orbit, you have been very loath to criticize any of what Donald Trump has done here publicly. I mean, you even talk to senators coming from, the North Dakota, South Dakota, places that are deeply dependent on Canada, that have been very hard hit by the trade war, and they're not really willing to speak out publicly, even if privately they are willing to sit across the table to you and say, this is really not the best thing. We hope it'll blow over. On the other hand, on the Democratic side, on my side of the aisle, we are, of course, very happy to take shots at the president for blowing up what we believe to be a really important and integrated North American economy. So you've seen this sort of political polarization, as you've seen in so much of our domestic political discourse, around what side of the partisan line you're on. What has been striking to me about my conversations with the business community is that after the initial shock in February, of the fact tariffs are here, the fact the president might actually very seriously disrupt the North American trade, the business community, by and large, I find here in the United States has been responding very pragmatically. I'm not in favor of what the president is doing, but is mostly focused on how do we manage through this uncertain and more costly situation, and is that we should be going in and advocating for, pushing more issues into the review to try to get through a successful review? Is that, as we've seen in the auto sector, we should be going in and advocating for some fairly arcane, below the headline exclusions to certain tariffs and certain ways of reducing our rates that let us manage this situation a little bit more effectively? Obviously, with the exemption for USMCA compliant goods going back in February and March and April, we saw companies invest a tremendous amount in doing their paperwork to make sure they could show that they were complying. with the USMCA agreement, which previously many importers didn't do, because if the tariff rate is zero, whether it's made in Mexico or whether it's made in Vietnam, for example, on an electronics component, you didn't really think about doing the paperwork. Now you do, because if it's USMCA compliant, it's zero, and if it's not USMCA compliant and you're bringing it in from Mexico, it's 25% tariffs now. So we've seen the business community take a very pragmatic approach, I think, to how do we navigate through this period of uncertainty. That's not to say the business community, at least here in the United States, is happy with what's going on. I think everybody would prefer that we get back to having a much more stable trading relationship. And I think they're advocating for that both publicly and privately with the Trump administration. But business is pragmatic. And if there are going to be changes to USMCA, whether it is changes to the rules of origin, whether it is changes to the base tariff rate, which I very much hope doesn't happen, but I think is obviously something the Trump administration is on the table, I think we are going to see the business community adapt pragmatically to it. Now, as you say, one of the ways in which the business community is going to adapt, if we from the American community fail to continue to promote a deeply integrated North American community, economic community, we're going to see Canadian and Mexican businesses diversify where they operate around the world, which might be good for some of them over the long term, but probably from my perspective here in the United States, who would actually like very strong trade ties across the border, isn't necessarily what I want to see happen from a U.S. national perspective.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Lots there, and we'll dig into that shortly. Jorge, let me turn over to you.
Thank you, Josh. Good afternoon, and thank you, Brookings, for giving me the honor to be in this panel with many distinguished guests. I would probably like to start by saying a little bit what we're living in Mexico. We have, under Claudia Sheinbaum, the second term of a leftist government, who is basically in power because of a lot of the inequalities that have resulted for many years in Mexico. They have won with overwhelming majority, which has allowed them to you need a super majority above 67% to be able to change the Constitution. And they have taken advantage of the super majority with their allies in Congress and the Senate to basically instill significant changes that include electricity investment. Today, the state needs to have 54% of the total output power. So that is kind of limiting. I believe that without electricity, it's hard to grow in the manufacturing sector. Now, other reforms include the judicial system. Today, the judicial system is voted on. It's a very complex way to do it. Each individual has to vote for more than 30 people. So you really need to do your homework, and that is creating instability. And basically, we're also changing the legal system, the legal way that you can defend yourself. And so this, in my opinion, has created instability. And this instability brings uncertainty, and uncertainty is not good for investment. If you look at the growth of Mexico, the world the last 7 years has grown more than 3%, while Mexico has grown less than 0.5%. So this brings me to the terms of uncertainty. And obviously, uncertainty is good for Donald Trump, because I think he likes it, because in the end, it permits you to bring back investments that would traditionally be in Mexico. When you have doubts if you will have the energy needed to put new business in Mexico, when the legal framework is not as good as it should be, then you rethink your investment. And I think that is by design. No, having said that, I believe that we have in Claudia Sheinbaum a very good president that has done an excellent job in dealing with Donald Trump. She has been able to maintain a cool head, despite that many things that President Trump is doing goes against her ideology and obviously against Mexico. But she has done a good job to be able to work. But having said this, I think the hardest part is still to come, the renegotiation of the TEMEC or the USMCA. And that is important to mention because as we speak, I always like to say that I think that people talk, is it going to be a renegotiation or is it just going to be a revision? I think it's a renegotiation already, and it's happening as we speak. And what I mean by this, through the 232 tariffs, basically today, 1/3 of exports to the U.S. are already have tariffs. And this could increase. If you look at the pharmaceutical sector, certain robotic sector, they're under review, and you could have basically 50%, up to 50% of tariffs already affected by the 232 rules. So I think we have to be careful about this renegotiation. I think when we start renegotiation, we will be already at a level possibly between 40 and 50% of the goods that are exported to the United States will have tariffs. So that is not a good place to start with. And the later this happens, the more renegotiation will be going on. Just to give you some sensitivity, Mexico exports to the U.S. 80% of its good. We're very dependent on exports, not only to create jobs, but good, high-paying jobs are very important. So this is very important. I think that you looked at Mexico, it was always looked as, hey, we have excess labor. I think that with Trump's immigration crackdown and a lot of people from Central America staying in Mexico, we don't have that as severe as labor problem as we've had. But if you look throughout the region, there is a lot less labor than we had before COVID. So that is a big challenge. So going forward, I think we have many challenges. We have to work together. We cannot take for granted the way we have been working. I was with an ex-Canadian ambassador, and he would tell me, Jorge, Mexico will never have the relation that it has, that Canada has with the USA. Basically, we fought a world war together. A lot of Canadians died in this war, and then basically we have the North America protection of the coast with Russia and all that. So we are very close. But those things that we thought that used to stand as the way for a relation have been, under Donald Trump, been put into question. So I think we have a lot of work to do. I think a lot of the work that we have to do in Mexico is basically to work with our allies in the United States to have more sense. I believe that the Mexican products make the U.S. competitive, not only for their products internally, but across the world. And that is very important. And something that we cannot let them forget is that a lot of the exports, if you look at the exports from Mexico, they have more American content already to begin with. So this is a very strong relation that we must maintain, we must take care of. And just as another thing, being in the Agriculture Council, if you look at North America, it's the most food secure region in the world. And we're also playing around with that. Food security equals national security. And if you have any doubts, when the COVID came, there was no face masks. There were no face masks around the world until all the Chinese population had it. So everybody will give the benefit of having food security, mask security to their country first. So we must recognize that and work together, because this alliance is super important going forward. And we have to think a lot more and beyond just one trade at a time. And we must think integrally across the board and have this together with our counterparts, with the business community, help make this message heard across our different governments.
Great, thank you. That's a message loud and clear. I think just pulling out a couple of data points to provide a bit further context, and panelists jump in where you want to add to this. we have Section 232 tariffs on the books and new ones coming. So they are sectoral tariffs which everyone globally faces. There's been some reduction of some of these sectoral tariffs with respect to Japan and others in these trade deals, but they are global. And then you have the trade that can come in essentially under the USMCA. And one of the things we've seen is that, I think you were saying this, Jorge, compliance with USMCA has gone up considerably, right? I think in Canada and in Mexico, it's sort of gone from around 50% to closer to 80, 90%, so it's sort of doubled. So the agreement, in a sense, for the trade that it covers has become even more important for North America. And then despite the sectoral tariffs, we are still in a world where Canada and Mexico are best positioned with respect to access to the US market, because what can come in under USMCA is effectively coming at zero tariffs. And so it's a different world with much higher tariffs. And so what we're looking at is relative positions. And at the moment, at least, Canada and Mexico are relatively still actually much better off than all other countries. And the question is, where does that end up? And that we need to see where the USMCA review hits on that. One of the questions I wanted to sort of pull out, and we sort of were getting at it, I think, in these responses, which is, what do you each think is what is the end game here? What would you, from your perspective, right? Like, and so the question for you, Peter, for instance, would be, and I know you've done a bit of thinking around this, is put a wrapper around where the administration is going with this, and what do you think they want to see come out of this USMCA review, or broader remaking of the North American trade relationship? But I'd like each of you to kind of like reflect on that from your own set of experiences. So John, I'll just start with you, and we'll work down.
Let's return to the lay of the land. Look at the geography of trade right now with the United States. The geography that counts for the American administration is Mexico, Canada, China. And if you throw in Europe, you'll have 60% of all the imports that go into the United States are in those four geographies. I mean, these are the places in the world that really count. And first and foremost, Mexico and Canada. The difference between Canada and the United States is that 40% of our GDP depends on trade, and 75% of what we export, 80%, I understand, Mexico, goes to the United States. So there you have a description in numbers of what the stakes are on both sides. And in our case, as we look to the future, USMCA right now, as it is, guarantees tariff-free circulation of merchandise, merchandise, between 85 to 95% between both places. Where the problem is the Section 232s on steel, aluminum, autos, on softwood lumber for Canada at 45% if you include other things, and then moving into pharmacies and derivatives. And that's where the short-term issue and where we're seeking relief right now is in Canada. Now, the big difference, the one that I think needs to be understood in relation to CUSMA is this. 50% of everything the Americans import into the country are inputs to make other products. And that's especially Canada and Mexico. And just a point here also, when President Trump and the administration talk of repatriating in the United States the manufacturing of cars, we're all mystified by that. I mean, there is not a complex product in the world that is made in a single country today. That world doesn't exist anymore. And so the difference with our economies is that they are very integrated. This is not the case for South Korea, Japan, Europe, but in the case of Mexico, Canada, and the United States, it is very integrated. And undoing that would have grave economic consequences for everyone, including the United States. Right now, I think, Joshua, that is the driving force behind the idea of maintaining what we already have as a trade agreement. So our number one objective is to maintain that and to enhance it, make it better. It is not a revision. I mean, the word, I think we fought over the word revision or renegotiation in 2020. Everyone accepted the word revision, knowing it would be a renegotiation if it came to that, and that's where we are at now. And our number one objective is going to be to preserve that trade relationship so that we can continue to build a very effective modern economy in North America.
I just want to echo one of those comments and then make a couple of additional comments. One is, you've heard this kind of across the table today, we have to address the 232 issues. And I say that from an American perspective, not from a Canadian or Mexican perspective. So, and the way in which the Trump administration has struck trade deals with the European Union, with Japan, and with Korea has actually made it even more important for us if we want a vibrant U.S. Manufacturing base, particularly in autos, to address the 232s. Because right now, as a result of Trump's trade deals with the European Union, with Japan and Korea, there's a car that is coming in from Germany or from Japan, Toyota or BMW car. It's currently tariffed at 15%. If you are an American manufacturer trying to build competing cars here in the U.S., and you have this integrated supply chain that has been built up over many years, and you're bringing parts in from Canada or Mexico, you're today paying 25% on those parts. And also, by the way, one of the biggest things you need to build that car here in the United States is steel and aluminum, which are now subject to 50% tariffs if they're coming in from Canada and Mexico. So you actually are now, in certain ways, I mean, there are games you can play, but in many ways, you actually have, because we have this integrated automotive supply chain that Trump has now put these 232 tariffs on, it's actually more expensive to build the car here in the United States with parts coming in from Canada and Mexico than it is to simply bring a car in from South Korea or from Germany. And that's not viable. Just as somebody who wants to see manufacturing here in the United States, that's just not viable. So, like, from our own manufacturing perspective here in the U.S., we have to deal with these 232 tariffs to make sure that we can bring in inputs from Canada, inputs from Mexico, tariff-free or near tariff-free levels in order to have a competitive manufacturing sector here in the United States. So, very much agree with that. And I think that needs to be one of the issues that we have to resolve through the USMCA renegotiation. I think obviously, as part of this renegotiation, there are going to be a set of long-standing bilateral irritants and dairy and, areas like that we fought over for many, many years. Back when I was in the Biden White House, we used to fight over it. Back when I was in the State Department many years ago, we used to fight over it. We'll have to, get through some of these long-time bilateral irritants, and President Trump has made that very clear. I think we'll be able to get there on that. And then I think there's an interesting set of questions that will come up as we get into this revision, review, renegotiation about what do we do on the set of kind of China-focused economic security issues that have become more and more important here in the United States. If you go back and look at the USMCA text from 2020, it was, as I think of it, it had large parts of it that were implicitly about China, but not explicitly about China. And to give you an example of what I mean, is under the original USMCA text in 2020, if you wanted a car to qualify for USMCA tariff-free treatment, 78%, if I remember correctly, of the content had to be from North America. And the reason for that is that the Trump administration was worried, well, if we don't have this content requirement, you could see a car being built in Mexico or in Canada with, 40% Chinese content that could then come into the U.S. Market. So it was sort of, there were provisions in it that were implicitly about dealing with China issues. If you look at what Trump is now doing with the sort of trade deal-esque things he is striking around the world, and we now have some text as of a couple of days ago of actual sort of trade deal text with Malaysia and with Cambodia, there are many more provisions that are explicitly about China, where there are commitments to cooperate if the U.S. needs to impose a tariff on China because China's flooding our market with some product. Cambodia and Malaysia are now explicitly on the hook to at least consider taking a similar action. They are explicitly on the hook now if there is a Chinese company that is building stuff in Malaysia and that Chinese-owned Malaysian company is flooding the market. They are now explicitly on the hook to do something a little bit TBD to address that sort of issue. So I think one of the issues we're going to have here in North America, and clearly the Trump administration is going to be pushing for, is how do we incorporate some of these, China-focused economic security provisions, which, to some degree were A, lighter, and B, more implicit in USMCA, and turn them into the kind of explicit commitments that we're beginning to see the administration land in other trade deals.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Jorge, let me turn to you. You're muted, I think.
Thank you, Joshua. I wanted to probably make some comments and follow on what Peter has said. And probably the most important point that I would like to make is China. And just probably you don't see it as much in Canada and the US, but 1 in 3 cars that are sold in Mexico today are Chinese. And it's incredible the prices they are being able to sell. They are probably 30% cheaper. Obviously, that's why they have so much market share, but 30% cheaper than a similar car from the US or Europe. So that is something that is happening. And that is something that if you permit them, I think they will end up being they will end up beating US manufacturing. And that's very important, no? Especially if you want to take all this manufacturing, that is what the current administration wants to do. They want to take all the manufacturing to the States. So I think they will lose competitivity around the world. And if you project that, these companies will end up disappearing. But I would let smarter guys know. But when you project it, they are being very competitive. The cars that the Chinese are building, they have all the bells, all the whistles, all the computers, and they do it at 70% the cost of a comparable car from the US. So that's here to stay. I think it's important that we get it and understand sometimes Trump's reaction. The US was the #1 trading partner to the world 20 years ago. That is not so anymore. Today, it is more the Chinese who are the first trading partner to the world. So the US needs to recuperate this leadership. And it's not so easy. And I think that's what needs to be done. I think if you take more manufacturing to the States, I think #1, you would struggle with labor. But #2, I think you would put more expensive products to the market, which would affect demand. So that's what we need to look at. I think we need to look at, again, we need to look ourselves as a region. We need to look at strategically to how this North American region can compete around the world. We have the China and North American perimeter, the North American fortress that the US is asking Mexico to be part of. And that is okay. That is the way we think we have to do it. But this has to come with certain benefits of being the partner of the US. I think the US has alienated a lot of its closer allies in a moment when the West needs to be working together more than ever. Like Peter said, there's integration on car parts and manufacturing from all over the world, and especially the Western countries. We need to maintain, we need to work hard, and we need to do it. So basically, when they're asking us, they're asking Mexico to be part of this North American fortress, which makes all the sense. But we are at a disadvantage, for example, with Japan and Korea that are not demanded. They can source materials from from China to make their products competitive, while Mexico and Canada will probably not have that luxury. So I think implicitly we will be less competitive, and we must really, as an industry, strategically look at this to make sure we have the most competitive region, because we cannot afford to keep on eroding the North American market leadership, further erode, because we've already eroded a little bit. Joshua.
Great, thank you. Jorge, I actually want to hover on this China issue a little bit longer, I think, because it's clearly important and it's come up in a number of different ways, just to sort of pull out a little bit more of what we mean by Fortress North America and what the ask may be ultimately of Canada and Mexico by the United States to participate in, and what the implications are economically and politically for each country of really committing and going down that pathway. John, let me turn it to you.
China it's all about China. You know, if you had to put it in a few words, this is all about China. But it's also about superpower competition. You know, when Mr. Trump was elected the first time, Trump 1.0, he made his first foreign trip abroad to Saudi Arabia. When he returned, two of his colleagues wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal on the 1st of June 2017, where essentially they say this: the president is returning from his first foreign trip abroad, and for us here in the United States, there is no global community. There is no global community. And the world is an arena. The word arena here is extremely important. In the arena, there is the victor and the vanquished. There is no multilateralism in the arena. There is no consensus in the arena. You either win or you lose. And they go on to say, we bring to this world unmatched military, social, economic, cultural strength. In fact, what they're talking about is power. And they finish by saying, and rather than deny this elemental reality, we embrace it. Now, the reason I return to that is that a Canadian Prime Minister has two overarching mandates, no matter what the circumstances. Keeping the country united and dealing with the United States is the second one. But the United States is a superpower. And superpowers behave a certain way. When there are obstacles, they tend to swat them aside, and they may cause collateral damages to friends and allies, not intentionally, but that's the way they behave. Back to China. In the space of our lifetime, we have seen the emergence of another superpower. And that's what we're up against, really. And the choice that the American administration has is, how are they going to manage that relationship with China? And are they going to do it with their allies? And when, in fact, one of the great strengths of America has always been its alliances throughout the world. Military alliances, its presence in the world, and also economic alliances. And so, yes, we do anticipate that on this matter, you point to it, Peter, in the first edition, the last edition of the USMCA, there was a section that said you cannot sign, if you sign an agreement with a non-market economy, you have to give a notice to the other side. Why Canada accepted that in Mexico, I'm not sure. It's an encroachment on our sovereignty. And by the way, elsewhere in the world, the now market economies are pretty much the exception, not the rule. And so how is this going to translate within USMCA? I'm not sure. But in the end, whatever it is, aren't we and the United States better served by reinforcing our North American market, no matter how we decide to deal with China? That's what makes sense from a Canadian point of view. Whether that'll be the case for our American neighbor remains to be seen.
Peter.
So I think it, as you say, it'll be interesting to see where the administration actually goes. Certainly from where I sit, there is a tremendous amount of opportunity for both Canada and Mexico, as well as for the United States, from allied cooperation to deal with China. And to give a couple of examples of how I think we have and potentially could see this play out over the future. One example of where I think this has played out has been with the growth in electronics manufacturing in Mexico over the last 6 or 7 years. Mexico, in many ways, was a winner from Trump's Term 1 trade war on China, where an awful lot of electronics were being manufactured because, and this gets back to the rules of origin that I talked about earlier, because under the USMCA, if you assembled a laptop or a desktop or some printer in Mexico, even if you used a fair amount of Chinese component parts, the fact that it was being assembled in Mexico meant that it could then come up to the United States tariff-free. So you actually saw substantial growth of kind of Mexican manufacturing, again, using a lot of Chinese component parts of electronics after Trump's first-term trade war on China. Now, I think there is a way in which you can envision that more directly addressing China and changing the rules of origin could actually further help Mexico by encouraging over time more of the onshoring of the production of those parts, which are currently coming from China, to be built in Mexico as well, to go into devices that would then come into the U.S. market. And you can see a way in which Mexico would be a winner from that. I take Canada as another example. Obviously, there's been a huge focus over the last couple of weeks, but more than that over the last couple of months about our need here in the United States, and it's something we can only do with our allies and partners, to diversify our sources of critical minerals, many of which we are highly dependent on from China. And we've seen the Trump administration over the last couple of months, particularly over the last month or so, adopt what I think of as sort of a flood the zone approach to try to deal with identifying other sources of critical minerals. They've been investing in companies, including some that have operations in Canada, and both Canada and Mexico have important potential mine sites for critical minerals and could do more processing. This is another area where we could see clear winners for our allies, not just for the United States, from a kind of allied shoring approach that keeps a very strong North American concept. But for that to work, the Trump administration is going to have to make the strategic decision it wants that to work. And it is going to have to make the decision that it is going to keep the barriers within North America really pretty low, including, as we were talking about, bringing down some of the 232 tariffs. So I am optimistic that we'll get there. And I think there is actually a tremendous amount of potential upside for all three economies from this kind of fortress North America concept that we hear Ambassador Greer talking about. But again, we have to decide as a country that we want that to be what we do.
Yeah, no, that's a really fair point. That's a threshold question. Jorge, I just want to, I'll return to you briefly if you've got anything you want to add about the China piece. I do want to ask you so we've been talking about the China element, I think, both through notions of transshipment, goods essentially passing through Canada or Mexico onto the US, but also in the supply chain context. Can you also reflect a little, because I think this comes into it in this conversation around Chinese FDI into Mexico. I think one of the concerns the US has had, you're seeing in the trade deals that the US has been striking, more focus on building investment screening regimes that are a bit more like what the US does with CFIUS. How's that look from a Mexican perspective?
Sure. I think we understand, and in conversations when I am in Washington, there is significant concern, Joshua, that the China is using as a backdoor Mexico. And I think there is some truth to that. There is. I think we have a porous customs border that permits a lot of products to pass by, foregoing sometimes taxes and thus recording. But I think it's not as big as the U.S. thinks it is. But we are noticing something. We're also in the industrial parks sector, and basically, like I said, 1 out of 3 cars is basically Chinese. We're also noticing in our industrial parks that almost 30 to 40% of the companies looking for manufacturing space in Mexico are also Chinese. So that is one way they can get around this. So it is something concerning. It is something that we need to take a look at. We have also seen an uptick, Joshua, of basically Chinese companies buying local manufacturing operations. So it's definitely something we have to take serious. I think when the renegotiation comes, there will be a lot of origin, where is the origin of those products? I think there are certain things, especially in electronics and pharma. Like I said before, the Mexico makes U.S. products competitive, but how about how many Chinese products, especially the electronic, make Mexican products competitive for the U.S.? So that is something we need to have clear, and to build on Peter's theme, that we have to look for the opportunity. I think our conversations should be around how do we bring these critical industries, especially in electronics, especially in pharma, and working together. Obviously, they can be done in Mexico, but I think they need to be done together with the U.S. And we need together to think which investment, what part is done in the U.S., what part is done in Mexico, to be strategic, to be strong, to be more competitive. So I think that's the type of decisions we need to have. I think if you look at Mexico, Mexican businessmen, the private sector is 99% in favor of the USMCA. Sometimes you hear voices that we need to diversify, but that's more from the government side. But we are very dependent on the USA. 80% of our products, our exports go there. So obviously, naturally, there is nervousness of looking for diversification. You know, any businessman will see if you're depending 80% of your business on one client, you need to think about it twice. And I think that's a little bit what's happening in Mexico.
On cars in China.
Yeah. I think that's something we need to look in Mexico and as a region to be able to give this certainty. I think Mexico is willing to go all in to do this North American partnership, but it has to come with reciprocal help and support. No, we cannot have the disadvantages of not being able to import anything from China without having other tariff advantages that will make it possible to make the investments in Mexico to substitute these Chinese imports.
John, you
And I wanted to add a word about China, because Canada's had a very difficult relationship with China since 2018. You're familiar with the story of Meng Wanzhou of Huawei. She's arrested on an extradition mandate by the Canadian officials in Canada on behalf of the United States. 3 days later, President Trump tweets, it was a tweet at the time, "I'm ready to drop the charges against Meng Wanzhou if I get a trade deal with China." So how do you deal? And then a few days later, two Michaels are abducted by the Chinese government. And we've been in this. Now, Canada, only a short while ago, the Biden administration puts 100% tariffs on electric cars from China. There are no electric cars in Canada from China. There are none. But the Canadian administration of Mr. Trudeau, because they want to be aligned with the Americans, puts 100% tariffs on Chinese electric cars. And what do we get in return? 100% tariffs on canola seeds, pork, and fishing products. And what are we getting out of the United States? 50% tariffs on steel, aluminum, 45%. Not exactly a good place to be, frankly. And so these are the things that we are going to have to navigate with in the next few years. And we watched in Mexico able to import electric cars and not have any retaliation. So it's a dilemma at this point for a number of countries like ours, certainly for Canada, how you manage both relationships. And by the way, it's not as though we can avoid China. Anyone who thinks we can just hive off China and not deal with them, this is a different world. And so how we manage our relationship with China is going to be a major, major issue for us in the future.
Great, thanks. And for those, the two Michaels being the two Canadians who got...
Two Canadians who were arrested by the Chinese authorities and jailed for 1,000 days. And it was the intervention of the White House, the Biden administration, that helped secure their release finally and return them home after Meng Wanzhou did a DPA with the American administration and was released to go home.
This is great. I want to get two more questions on the table. One is a quick follow-up, which is one of the themes I think that's coming through here is, to put it sort of broadly, a breakdown in, I think, trust right across North America at a time when in some respects, the expectations are that we may actually end up doing more together. At least we need to do more together. And I think the China piece really calls out this prospect of potentially quite a broad-based aligning of tariffs across North America on China and potentially third countries, with implications for autonomy over trade policy and so forth. So the pathways that we're looking down are ones of close reliance on each other, not less, at a time when there is, less trust. So looking forward into the USMCA review, into the role of the agreement, and beyond what the USMCA provide, how do you rebuild the trust, in one way of putting it, between the US Canada, the US Mexico, that gives the political cover to go down that pathway, to do what needs to be done?
Well, I'm sure Peter and our other guest has a lot to say about that. In Canada, the assumption is that our relationship with the American administration and United States writ large has changed forever. It's no matter what happens in the future. And by the way, that's not. There's two parts to that. One of it is about us. It's about us in Canada, about how we run our economy, how we do things, and whether we have not been effective, we've not been successful in building infrastructure, doing things. We have a number of the issues that a number of modern jurisdictions are dealing with. But the other part I want to reiterate, though our Prime Minister says that it'll never be the same, it is very clear to Canadians that we have an outstanding relationship with the American people, with whom we get along and we like, and we believe that we are very lucky to be born in this neighborhood. In the lottery of citizenships, I hope you won't mind me saying this as a Canadian, but we believe we won first prize. And my Mexican friends would probably say the same thing in Americans, but admittedly, objectively, to be born in North America and to live here, when you know how the rest of the world is a real privilege. So we like the American people, but we're going to have to, as we look ahead, we know that the relationship will have changed forever.
Peter, don't feel compelled to come in on every question.
Rebuilding trust is going to be that's a hard one, because I think as sort of events over the weekend illustrated, with the president threatening, it's not yet actually opposed them, but he said he would raise additional 10% tariffs in light of Doug Ford's ad here in the United States. It makes it very hard to talk about trust when these things come off and on. And I think that was particularly unfortunate because if you look back over the last 2 or 3 months, there had been these negotiations underway to try to have some, what you might think of in a different context with somebody who spent many years at the State Department, confidence building measures where you could have seen, some sort of limited reductions of the tariffs that have come up over the last year to kind of set a better stage for the USMCA renegotiation. Those now do seem to be on hold as a result of the flare-up over the weekend. Now, so I think it's going to be hard. I think strategically what I would recommend is we do need to get back to the table on some confidence-building measures. I think that if there are going to be dramatic changes to the USMCA agreement, from where I sit, it probably would be worth taking changes to Congress. There are pros and cons to that approach. We've seen with the Trump administration this year, like the fact that got passed by Congress doesn't necessarily mean it's stable, but I think it would make it more stable. And then the third thing that I think would help, which is out of the hands of the negotiators and would not be perfect, will be actually the outcome of the Supreme Court case hearing the lawsuit against many of Trump's tariffs. And here's why I think that is matters to these negotiations, because so there's a Supreme Court case out there that's going to be heard next week challenging the IEEPA tariffs. These are not the steel and aluminum tariffs, not the product tariffs, but that are the tariffs that are on Mexico and Canada right now, purportedly for fentanyl, and the ones that Trump, had threatened to raise on very short notice over the weekend. If Trump loses that case, he will still be able to impose tariffs on Canada and Mexican products as he has with the 232s, but he can't do it overnight. The other authorities he has out there are going to take, months to put into place. You can only move them with notice and comment rulemaking and that kind of thing. And so you actually will get out of this world. I mean, the Supreme Court case means Trump will have to act in a little bit more of a predictable manner, which may not resolve long-term risks from the perspective of the Canadians and Mexicans, where this is headed over the long run, but at least give you some confidence that you might not wake up on Tuesday and find your tariff rate has doubled.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Jorge, did you want to come in on this?
Sure. Just to round things out, I think the IEEPA tariffs are they are not included in USMCA compliant parts. So that is something that if they go away, the Trump administration might have the temptation to put the 232 tariff. So that's not so good. But I would just finalize with two things. Number one, I think this process with the U.S. has brought Mexico and Canada together. We have very good relations. We're working closer than ever. We realize even though this might be a bilateral negotiation on both ends, I think we're working together and we're already exploring a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of back and forth between business people trying to do investments across each of our borders. So I think that's what's important. On the other side, talking with the Americans, I think in general, things will be good. No, this conversation reminded me of Winston Churchill's that Americans will always do the right thing after they have exhausted all options. And I think that's already happening. We don't really see it every day, but basically, I am sure that behind all these tariffs, I think there's a lot of non-public negotiations with Trump and his team, because they realize how much is hurting. If you just look at the U.S. Car manufacturing sector, their profits have reduced significantly quarter to quarter with tariffs. They have not passed this on to the clients, but it's a matter of time before that happens. So I think there are inflationary pressures at the end, and I think we're stronger together as a region if we keep these tariffs off and we focus on growing together and taking the opportunity and taking that business from China, Josh.
Great, thanks. I'm going to open up to the audience shortly, so get ready your questions. I want to pick up, Jorge, on your reference there to the bilateral conversations that are underway. USTR, Greer, and others have made clear that there's going to be a critical bilateral element to the USMCA review. US talking with Canada, US talking with Mexico. Some of these issues are bilateral in nature and I think pragmatically should be addressed bilaterally. There are others that are trilateral. I guess what I'd like to hear from the panel is how they see the process going forward, how much of it will be bilateral, what should be trilateral, and what's the end result in terms of USMCA, side letters, agreements. We can touch on what role Congress may or may not have in the process going forward as well. On
bilateral agreements, by the way, this isn't new. I was in the federal government at the time we did started the NAFTA negotiations, and you'll remember that there was a clear, and the Clinton administration had demanded this, but we had started under President Bush, negotiations for two-side agreements, one on labor and the other one on the environment. And I remember the purists in the trade community felt, oh, this is wrong. We should only always deal with trade and not divert. But that's been an evolution in time. Now, what is new is security. And security, it wasn't a preoccupation then. It will be a preoccupation right now. In our approach to these negotiations, we thought it took a long time for the Americans to pull the trigger on consultations that the law obliges the American side to do. We're doing our consultations. We expect the inventory of issues, Joshua, to be the ones we're familiar with. And on the agricultural side, maybe on data on certain numbers of issues, American content on automobiles, things like that. And so we're not. And with our Mexican counterparts, we anticipate being aligned on most issues. And if there is not an alignment, I think we're going to just talk very frankly to each other and not create, at least avoid creating any situation of conquer and divide and conquer. And as much as we are aligned, I think that serves everyone best. So in the fall, I think we'll probably have a better sense of where we're going when the American process will have been formalized. Canada's doing its consultations, and then we're off. We're off to these discussions, and hopefully they'll be productive and preserve CUSMA.
Peter, any reflections on bilateral, what that looks like? And you mentioned Congress. Anything more you want to say about what role Congress may or may not have next year?
Let me just echo the comment. I mean, there's always been a bilateral element to multilateral trade deals. That was true during the NAFTA negotiations, true during the USMCA negotiations, it was true during the ill-fated TPP negotiations of the Obama administration. It was true during the W administration on the CAFTA-DR agreement. Like they're always, even if you have a multilateral agreement, there are going to be things you need to resolve bilaterally, and you do it through side letters or side agreements or informal understandings or different modalities here. And what I see, so the fact that the Trump administration, is going to have some issues that are resolved bilaterally with Canada and then with Mexico shouldn't be surprising at all. It does strike me, though, what's different is that, there is a strain of thought in the Trump administration would prefer more of the negotiation to be done bilaterally, which I think is sort of reflective of their overall view that they've wanted to do pretty much every trade negotiation they've had this time around bilaterally, because I think it maximizes their leverage. Now, I am reasonably optimistic that despite that strain in the Trump administration, the North American economy is integrated. The Canadian and the Mexican sides would like to have a somewhat more trilateral negotiation. And if we're going to have a tripartite deal, and we are going to have a tripartite, we're not going to have one deal with Canada and one deal with Mexico. We're too integrated for that. So I think the Trump administration will ultimately kind of come to the conclusion that, yes, of course, there are some issues resolved bilaterally. This is fundamentally going to be a trilateral negotiation.
Okay, thanks. Jorge, do you want any reflections?
Just very fast, Joshua. I would just, the United States is a superpower. United States represents 1/4 of the world trade. So obviously, there's strength in numbers working together with Canada. Together, Mexico and Canada are the destination of 30% of the tariffs of the exports of the U.S. So it makes sense to try to stay together to negotiate a better deal that we would not do so individually. But I think it's going to be hard. I think, like Peter said, there is an advantage, and they will do better negotiating for themselves if they can keep it like that. So I anticipate that there will be bilateral at most. No, there might be other things that are important. I think the people moving across. I heard it from my colleagues in both the U.S. and Canada. No, both of the private sector believe that there has to be some sort of agreement to allow people to move temporarily, and I think there needs to be a solution. I tell my counterparts that they can't think that there's going to be a huge outlook. People prefer to stay in the country, and today they're finding opportunities in Mexico, and I think most will decide to stay. But I think that type of human migration agreements will have to be a part in this new renegotiation.
Okay, great. Let me open it up to Q&A from the audience. If you've got a question, raise your hand. Please briefly introduce yourself, and please ask a question. We'll start at the front here, and then we'll move to the back.
Thank you. Antonio Ortiz from Georgetown University and the Mexican Foreign Trade Council. I don't think it'll be bilateral or trilateral. I think this is, as you conveyed, a four-way negotiation. Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. in the room, China in the discussions, and we have to come to grips with Chinese trade and Chinese investment. I would like to hear your views on rules of origin. What if China sets up shop in Mexico or in Windsor, because you would prefer Windsor, or in Detroit, and fulfills the rule of origin? So we're no longer importing cars, that we're manufacturing Chinese cars in the region. I don't think we have full answer to that. and the OEM's use of Chinese components. And then secondly, a B2B potential solution, maybe using blockchain, which we didn't have when we were renegotiating the NAFTA, to really track down supply chains. And if we do that, and there's business-to-business cooperation on blockchain, maybe the U.S. would have less excuse to say this is a triangulation, this is from China. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thanks. Who wants to answer that? Peter, do you want to?
I'll offer brief thoughts, but I want to hear others. So I actually want to take your technology comment first, because I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and I think it is true kind of not just in the North America context, but more broadly for trade. I do think that greater use of technology, whether it's blockchain or also just AI to analyze a whole bunch of data, is going to make it possible to think about what is covered by trade agreements a little bit differently than we have historically, because it'll be much easier to look at, oh, really, what are the components that go into this good? It'll also be easier if you're thinking about U.S. trade with like Indonesia to understand, oh, this is a product that is coming in from a particular site in Indonesia that we think has high labor standards, or it's one that's coming in without high labor standards, and maybe you can treat them differently. So I actually think technology is going to open up ways of thinking about how we regulate trade differently over the next couple of years. So I 100% agree with you. 100% agree with you on that. On the rules of origin, I mean, so let me give just an analytic answer and then maybe offer what I think should happen. As an analytic answer, I think it is very important that we will be getting into the details of that negotiation after we see where President Trump and President Xi land on the bilateral deal. Because I think we have to be realistic, and I say this as somebody who's, in my personal views, fairly hawkish on China, but we have to be realistic that if we are in a position over the next couple of months where Washington and Beijing are getting into at least sort of a détente, and where the President Trump, over I think the objections of some of his advisors, could try to attract more Chinese investment to the United States. I'm not saying I think that's likely, but it is certainly not impossible if you look at the other trade deals that we have there. Like if we are in a period where we're in a bit of a China-U.S. détente over the next year or two, you're probably going to see less focus on, the rules of origin. And if a Chinese company is opened up in Mexico, how do we treat that? Like, that's just it's an analytic point. I think we have to take that as a possibility that might materialize. We will know that over the next couple of months, because we'll see where President Trump and President Xi go on the bilateral deal. Now, as somebody who is fairly hawkish on China, and where I think some of the more hawkish individuals in the Trump administration would be, I think they would say, we should find, at least for not everything because it's too complicated, but for some of these key sectors, and you've highlighted some on Jorge, you've highlighted some on pharmaceuticals, some on critical minerals, things like that. I think the administration would be saying, well, at least for those sectors, if it is manufactured by a Chinese company in Mexico, maybe it doesn't get USMCA treatment. And I think that's a very reasonable landing spot that would, in light of technology, actually be implementable, that in a way, a couple of years ago would have been very hard to actually monitor and enforce.
And you're right at the heart of what the issues will be, Antonio, on rules of origin. And Southeast Asia, as we've seen in the last few days, this is going to be a huge, very big challenge. And President Trump is already giving an indication of what the position of the American administration will be. They're saying if it's a product from Vietnam, fine. If it's a product that has gone through Vietnam to come to the United States. But the key, and I think that's what you're alluding to, Peter, is that really, is this product transformed? Is there added value? And in that definition, we should be able to live in a world where rules of origin are reasonable, given the fact, again, there is no single complex minimum product made in a single country in the world. That world doesn't exist anymore. And so, in the case of Canada, I think 25% of everything we export to the United States comes from the United States. Gives you an idea of how we... So on rules of origin, we should be able to land in a reasonable position that allows us to also practice what basic economists recognize as comparative advantage. Isn't that what the world was supposed to be about? If we're going to be competitive, that we be able to recognize comparative advantages.
Jorge, did you want to?
Yeah, very, very fast. I would just add, I think there will be certain products that will be considered strategical that they don't want Chinese companies to be investing even through Mexico. No, so we have to be careful. We have to know that list. We have to be in agreement. The other thing that we have to be careful, I think, is important is sometimes the U.S. pressured us not to have a BYD plant in Mexico. No, this Chinese auto company manufacturing, but at the same time you have Volvo in the U.S., which is a Chinese company. So I think we just have to have clear rules, and they have to work across the aisle. You can't have certain rules that you permit Volvo to be in the United States, what you don't really permit manufacturing companies to be in the States. So those type of rules need to be set, and we need to be clear on them.
Great. Question at the back.
Yes, thank you. James Patterson, formerly with the State Department. The gentleman in the center, please pardon me, I forgot your name.
Jean
Yes.
Charest.
You spoke about Trump one administration officials writing an op-ed to the Wall Street Journal using the term arena, and that implied
Correct.
winners are losers. And the gentleman on the end here, Mr. Peter, used the term trade war several times. He's not with the administration. And being a trade war implies winners or losers. So I'm thinking that perhaps the discussion overall, whether it's within the administration or outside the administration, using terms like arena and trade war may not be conducive to the stable trade relationship that we are looking for. And so perhaps if we think in terms of a trade reset or a trade revision or a trade discussion, there are other terms we can use that might help facilitate us getting where we want to be.
I hear you, and I understand your comment very well, especially after the episode of the Doug Ford ad on Ronald Reagan and what he had said about trade and how it impacted or had an impact on President Trump. And so, yes, we are sensitive to the fact that in our interactions with our American counterparts, we have to be sensitive to the way they see things. Now, the piece I was referring to was published in the Wall Street Journal on the 1st of June, 2017. It was co-written by Gary Kahn and H.R. McMaster. And you're all welcome to look it up. And the word arena was used by them in that piece. It wasn't the American-Canadian side who worded it. Those were the words that they used in that piece in Trump 1.0. And if that was the view of the world of Trump 1.0, our assumption is that this new administration is on steroids in regards to that vision of the world.
The Reagan ad was supported by Reagan scholars at the Reagan Foundation in California.
Well, you know what I did? I put on my social media the whole 7-minute segment of Mr. Reagan's intervention, and I making the comment that thanking President Trump for attracting attention to this intervention by President Reagan. And if anyone just wants to listen to the whole 7 minutes, please go right ahead and listen to it and make up your own mind. That being said, sir, there is one thing we do understand. In our interactions with our American counterparts, yes, we have to be sensitive to the fact that certain things you may say or do may not be well received. And we accept that. And we're all trying to be careful not to offend anyone by raising a number of issues. So, and the last week episode, I don't think the ad was offensive done by Premier Ford, frankly. But we now know that it was received that way by the president, and so be it. We don't want to be distracted by that. Let's focus on what the real issues are.
Any other questions in the room? This lady at the front here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Pamela Starr from Monarch Global Strategies in the University of Southern California. We've been sort of working on the assumption that there's going to be a review, a renegotiation, whatever you call it, and that it's a yes. It's going to happen because we're too integrated, so we're going to have something positive come out of this. I'm just interested to know your reactions to the possibility that it's going to be a maybe. That maybe what happens is that we go through these negotiations and the US side says, yeah, let's do this again next year. Because one thing we know about President Trump is he doesn't believe that he can get to a good negotiated resolution without some sort of power over his counterpart, some power of coercion. So wouldn't be the possibility of us redoing this year after year after year as the treaty permits be a potential strategy for the US side?
Can I, you know, you put your finger on something when we say the relationship has been changed forever. Well, there you go. We could very well negotiate an agreement and then the agreement is just contravened or changed a year later. And that's the way it's going to work. And we assume, and we assume that it may vary, the world may look that way. So we're just going to have to live with it. And finally, whatever happens in the relationship with the United States, they will always be our number one economic partner, whether it's tariffed or not tariffed. That's that's the reality. And we will, by the way, always be the most important buyer of services of the Americans. So Canadians are, I think, pretty sanguine about that. They understand that. We prefer the first scenario, but if that's the way it's going to be, that's just the way it'll be. We'll just learn to live with it.
Peter,
Just very, very briefly, because I know we're at time. So I understand the point of the question. I'm actually reasonably optimistic, though, that that's not the world we're going to be in. I am reasonably optimistic as we see President Trump going out and cutting deals with other countries, as we see, President Trump in some ways beginning a little bit to moderate some of the more extreme ambitions on trade and extreme tariff rates that were true back in April, that we are going to get to yes on a deal, renegotiated, reviewed, changed deal next year. Now, is that a 99.5% confidence interval? No, it's not. But is that a very high confidence interval? I am quite optimistic about it. To the point on, I think there is a reality, Jean. I agree with Jean, like we'll get a deal. The deal is not going to be as sort of, permanently unchanged. And there's always a chance that Trump will renegotiate, as he has already, right? He didn't wait till next year to start blowing things up this time around. That said, I actually think, and this is in some sense gazing at the crystal ball and whatnot, but I actually think that when Trump strikes these deals, well, there will continue to be friction around the edges. I've already seen that with the European Union and his sort of deal with the European Union. I actually think the core of these deals will hold. I'm optimistic that he wants them as deals. He will get there as deals, and the core of them will hold for at least a couple of years. So I'm going to end on an optimistic note, but I do accept that we might not be in the optimistic world.
Great. The core will hold for a couple of years. I love the optimism. Look, we're coming up to time. So firstly, I think we've had a rich conversation. We've really underscored the critical importance of the North American economic relationship for everyone, as well as for geopolitical competition with China, and that we have a lot of opportunity, I think, to even build on that relationship going forward, but we need to build trust as well in the relationship to really make that durable and stick. So we have a lot of work ahead of us to make all of that come true. So I want to firstly thank the panelists for their time and for engaging in this rich conversation. I want to thank everyone who has been here in person and online as well. And with that, I think we'll call the event to a close. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.